My name is Ethan, and I used to be a skeptic. I wasn't the aggressive kind, the sort who'd mock people for their beliefs. I was the quiet, confident kind, a man who had built his life on logic and tangible evidence. As an architectural historian, I believed that buildings were simply brick and mortar, wood and nail. They held stories, yes, but those stories were human, etched in the wear of floorboards and the fading of paint, not in spectral energy or lingering spirits. My reality was a well-ordered structure, with a foundation of science and walls of reason. Then, I was assigned the Sallie House. My firm had been contracted to document and assess several historical properties in Atchison, Kansas, for a preservation grant. The Sallie House, with its unassuming white and blue facade, was just another file on my desk, another set of blueprints to analyze. I had heard the whispers, of course. It was impossible to research Atchison without stumbling upon its reputation as the most haunted town in Kansas, with the Sallie House as its dark crown jewel. Tales of a ghost girl named Sallie, of mysterious fires, and of malevolent attacks on male visitors. I'd read them with the detached amusement of an academic studying local folklore. It was charming, in a macabre way, but utterly irrelevant to my work. My job was to date the timber, assess the structural integrity, and document the original floor plan, not to chase phantoms. My recent divorce had left me with a craving for solitude and focus. The prospect of spending a few weeks alone in a quiet Kansas town, immersing myself in the silent language of old houses, felt like a prescription for healing. I saw it as an escape, a way to rebuild my own internal structure after the messy demolition of my marriage. I believed I had complete control over my reality, that I could compartmentalize the emotional chaos and focus on the clean, predictable lines of my work. The Sallie House was just a job. A slightly eccentric, story-laden job, but a job nonetheless. I arrived in Atchison on a crisp autumn afternoon. The house on North 2nd Street looked exactly as it did in the photographs, a quaint, almost painfully normal-looking home nestled in a quiet neighborhood. The air was still, and the rustling leaves were the only sound that broke the silence. Inside, the house smelled of dust, old wood, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers. I dismissed it as the inevitable scent of a long, unoccupied building. The first few days were peaceful, productive. I moved through the house with my measuring tape, my camera, and my notepad, charting the passage of time in the sag of the floors and the cracks in the plaster. The ground floor, once supposedly a doctor's office, was bare and echoing. Upstairs, the small bedrooms held a palpable stillness. One room, designated as the nursery in the legends, was filled with an unsettling collection of dolls and toys left by decades of ghost hunters and curious visitors. Their glass eyes seemed to watch me as I worked, their painted smiles fixed in a silent, knowing chorus. I found it all rather pathetic, this desperate need to project a narrative onto an empty space. The first subtle incursion into my well-ordered reality was a sound. It was the third night. I was working late at my makeshift desk in the living room, poring over old property records. Faintly, from the floor above, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping. Thump, 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 like a small rubber ball being bounced gently on a wooden floor. I paused, listening. The house was old. Old houses make noises, settling foundations, contracting wood, the wind rattling a loose shutter. I cataloged the rational explanations, ticked them off in my mind, and returned to my work. But the sound persisted, a soft, insistent heartbeat in the silent house. I finally sighed, annoyed at the distraction, and went upstairs to investigate. The nursery was dark, the moonlight filtering through the dusty window pane casting long shadows that made the collection of toys look grotesque and menacing. The air was noticeably colder here, a detail my rational mind attributed to poor insulation. I scanned the floor. A small, faded rubber ball lay near the leg of a rocking chair, perfectly still. The thumping had stopped the moment my foot touched the top step. I chalked it up to the wind, or perhaps a branch tapping against the roof, and went back downstairs, a faint unease now prickling at the edges of my confidence. The next day, it was an object. I had left my heavy-duty flashlight on the kitchen counter, a precise and deliberate placement I remembered clearly. After spending a few hours in the damp, oppressive basement taking foundation measurements, I came back up to find the flashlight sitting in the middle of the nursery floor, its beam pointing directly at the rocking chair. My heart hammered against my ribs. There was no rational explanation for this. I was the only one in the house. I had locked the doors. Had I been so absorbed in my work that I'd forgotten moving it? My mind, a fortress of logic, began to search desperately for cracks in its own foundation. Stress, fatigue, the power of suggestion from all the ghost stories I'd read. It had to be one of those. I refused to consider the alternative. But the subtle incursions continued, chipping away at my skepticism. Tools would disappear from where I'd left them, only to reappear in bizarre places. The smell of sulfur would suddenly fill a room and then vanish just as quickly. I began to hear whispers, faint and indistinct, like a radio playing in another room, always stopping the moment I tried to focus on them. I started sleeping poorly, plagued by nightmares of a little girl with old, angry eyes, and the chilling sensation of being watched. I was a man of reason, a man who believed in the tangible, yet I found myself jumping at shadows, my carefully constructed reality beginning to warp and buckle at the seams. I was still telling myself it was all in my head, a product of isolation and stress. I was wrong. I was in the opening act of a play I didn't know I was a part of, and the curtain was just beginning to rise on the true, suffocating horror that awaited me. My carefully ordered world was crumbling, and the fortress of my skepticism was being besieged from within. The subtle anomalies in the Sallie House had escalated from mere curiosities to deeply unsettling events that I could no longer explain away with logic. My work, once a refuge, now felt like a sentence, each day trapping me further within walls that seemed to breathe with a malevolence I was beginning to feel in my own bones. The fear was a low hum beneath the surface of my thoughts, a constant companion that gnawed at my sanity. I knew I needed answers, not for the historical record, but for my own survival. My investigation began online, in the dead of night, with the house groaning around me like a dying animal. I devoured every article, every blog post, every crackpot forum thread about the Sallie House. The stories were all variations on a theme. Dr. Charles Finney, a botched appendectomy on a 6-year-old girl named Sallie, her tragic death on the operating table that once occupied the ground floor. The legend claimed she haunted the house, a playful but mischievous spirit. But as I dug deeper, a darker narrative emerged. Many paranormal investigators and former residents spoke of something else, something older and more sinister that used the story of the little girl as a mask. They spoke of a man-hating entity, of violent physical attacks, and of a presence so oppressive it felt demonic. The words sent a tremor of cold, primal fear through me. The official records were a dead end. I spent an entire day at the Atchison County Historical Society, sifting through brittle newspapers and dusty ledgers. There was no record of a girl named Sallie dying in that house. No birth certificate, no death certificate, no mention in Dr. Finney's own sparse records. It was as if she had never existed. This discovery, which should have brought relief, only amplified my terror. If Sallie wasn't real, then what was? What was in the house with me? My desperation led me to seek out the locals. Most were tight-lipped, offering nervous smiles and vague warnings to be careful. They knew the house's reputation, and they wanted nothing to do with it. But one name kept coming up: Eleanor Vance, an elderly woman who had lived next door to the Sallie House for over 60 years. She was described as the town's unofficial historian, a woman who had seen it all. I found Eleanor tending to her rose bushes, her hands gnarled with age, but her eyes sharp and intelligent. When I told her which house I was working in, her welcoming smile tightened. She invited me in for tea, and as we sat in her sun-drenched, lavender-scented living room, a world away from the oppressive gloom of the house next door, she told me a story that chilled me to the core. The story they tell about the little girl. That's for the tourists, she began, her voice a low, serious whisper. The real trouble in that house is older than any of us. Before the Finneys, before the town was even properly settled, there were stories. The natives called this land wrong, a place of bad energy, and that house was built right on top of the worst of it. She told me about the strange tenants over the years, families that moved in full of hope, only to flee in the middle of the night months later, their faces pale and haunted. She spoke of a woman who lived there in the 1940s who was driven to madness, claiming something in the walls was trying to wear her skin. And then she told me about the Pickmans, the young couple who lived there in the early 90s, whose experiences had first brought the house to national attention. Tony Pickman, she said, her eyes locking onto mine. That poor man. The house hated him. It would throw things at him, whisper his name, and it would scratch him. She leaned forward, her voice dropping further. Deep, bloody scratches, 3 at a time, that would appear out of nowhere on his chest and back. His wife, Deborah, she didn't want to believe it at first. The thing in that house is clever. It isolates you, makes you think you're going crazy. It turns your loved ones against you. Her words hit me like a physical blow. Isolation, the feeling of going crazy. My own colleagues, my friends, even my ex-wife Sarah had already dismissed my growing anxieties. When I'd tried to call Sarah a few nights before, my voice trembling as I described the moving flashlight, she had been coldly rational. Ethan, you're overworked and you've just been through a traumatic divorce. You're seeing things. Get some rest. Her skepticism, once a shared trait we'd admired in each other, now felt like a betrayal. A wall between us I could no longer breach. I was completely, utterly alone in this. The key, Eleanor told me, was a diary she had been given by the daughter of a woman who lived in the house in the 1950s. The woman, named Mary, had been a recluse, and her diary was her only confidant. Eleanor retrieved a small leather-bound book from a locked wooden chest and handed it to me. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with a frantic looping script. Reading Mary's diary was like staring into the abyss. She wrote of the same things I was experiencing, the cold spots, the whispers, the disembodied footsteps. But her entries grew more and more unhinged. She described seeing a tall, shadowy figure of a woman, not a little girl, with a face contorted in rage. She wrote about a dark presence in the basement, something she called the root of the sickness. She believed the entity fed on fear and misery, and that it had a particular hatred for men, seeing them as intruders in its domain. The most terrifying entry was the last one, dated the day before she was committed to an asylum. It wears a child's face to trick you, she wrote, the letters shaky and nearly illegible. It promises play, but it only wants pain. I saw it tonight. It peeled back the girl's face and showed me its true one. It is not Sallie. It is the mother of despair. It has marked me. It says the house is its body, and anyone who enters is a disease to be purged. It promises it will scratch the unbelief from my soul. I closed the diary, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The moment of pure, unadulterated terror had arrived. This wasn't a ghost. It wasn't the restless spirit of a little girl. It was something ancient, something deceptive, something utterly malevolent. And I was living inside its body. There was no escape. The locks on the doors were meaningless. The house itself was the trap. The subtle incursions, the whispers, the moving objects. They were not random acts. They were a calculated campaign to break down my sanity, to isolate me, to make me vulnerable. And now, I understood with a horrifying certainty that the game was over. The time for subtlety was past. The entity knew I had discovered its secret. It knew I had read the rules of its horrifying game. And it was coming to purge the disease. The aftermath of my visit with Eleanor Vance and the chilling revelations from Mary's diary was a complete shattering of my world. The fragile membrane separating my perceived reality from a living nightmare had been torn away, leaving me exposed and raw. I returned to the Sallie House not as a historian, but as a prisoner awaiting his sentence. Every creak of the floorboards was a footstep, every shadow a looming figure. The house was no longer a subject of academic study. It was a predator, and I was its cornered prey. The haunting escalated with a terrifying immediacy. The playful, subtle tricks were replaced by open, aggressive acts of psychological warfare. The whispers were no longer indistinct. They became my name, hissed from the dark corners of a room or murmured directly into my ear as I tried, and failed, to sleep. Ethan. It would drawl, a dry, sibilant sound that scraped against my nerves. The voice was a discordant blend, sometimes a young girl's mocking sing-song, other times the guttural rasp of an old woman. One evening, I was in the kitchen, my back to the doorway, trying to force down a tasteless sandwich. A sudden, intense cold enveloped me, so profound it felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I turned slowly, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Standing in the doorway for just a fraction of a second, I saw her. Not a little girl, but the shadowy figure of a woman, tall and gaunt, her form indistinct, as if woven from the very darkness of the house. Her face was a blur of rage, and then she was gone. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair, a strangled cry escaping my lips. My calls for help were met with a wall of disbelief that only served to heighten my isolation. My boss at the firm, Mr. Abernathy, listened with strained patience as I tried to explain that I couldn't work in the house anymore, that it wasn't safe. "Ethan, this is highly unprofessional," he'd said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "This is a major project. Perhaps you need to take a few days off. It sounds like the stress is getting to you." He didn't believe me. He thought I was breaking down. My friend David, a fellow academic and a staunch skeptic, was even more dismissive. "Dude, you've been reading too many of the local ghost stories," he chuckled over the phone. "It's called the ideomotor effect. You're psyching yourself out. There's no such thing as ghosts, man. Get a grip." They were the voices of the world I used to belong to, the rational, sensible world. Now they sounded like they were speaking a foreign language from a distant shore. They couldn't see what I saw. They couldn't feel the suffocating presence that was pressing in on me from all sides. The entity was succeeding. It had severed my tethers to the outside world, leaving me adrift in a sea of terror. The physical attacks began a few nights later. I had finally collapsed into a fitful sleep on the lumpy couch downstairs, too terrified to go up to the second floor. I was jolted awake by a searing pain across my chest. I gasped, scrambling upright, my hands flying to the source of the agony. It felt like my skin was on fire. I tore at the buttons of my shirt, my fingers fumbling in the dark. In the faint glow of the street lamp outside, I saw them. 3 long parallel scratches, welted and red, running from my collarbone to my stomach. They were deep, beaded with blood that was already beginning to stain my undershirt. Panic, pure and primal, seized me. There was no one else in the room. I had been alone. The marks were a violent, undeniable testament to the presence in the house. This was its answer to my discovery. This was the punishment for my unbelief, just as Mary's diary had prophesied. The attacks became a nightly ritual of torment. I would be shoved by unseen hands, my hair pulled, my ankles grabbed as I walked up the stairs, and the scratches, always the scratches. I would wake with new ones, burning on my back, my arms, my legs. They were a brutal, visceral form of communication, a language of pain and possession. The house was marking me, claiming me as its own. My sanity began to fray and unravel. I stopped answering the phone. I barricaded myself in the living room at night, pushing the heavy desk against the door, a futile gesture I knew wouldn't stop whatever was tormenting me. I was a wreck, gaunt and hollow-eyed, starting at every sound. The rational historian was gone, replaced by a paranoid, terrified animal trapped in a cage. I lost track of time. Days and nights blurred into a continuous cycle of dread and exhaustion. The world outside the windows of the Sallie House ceased to feel real. The house was my entire reality now, a personal hell designed just for me. In a moment of desperate clarity, I knew I had to fight back or I would be consumed entirely. I remembered Eleanor Vance, the old woman next door. She was the only one who had believed me, the only one who understood the true nature of the evil in this place. Stumbling out of the house into the blinding daylight, I ran to her home, my hands shaking, my voice a hoarse croak as I pleaded for help. She took one look at the fresh, bloody scratches on my forearm and her face hardened with grim resolve. "It's time," she said. There's only one way to confront this thing. But I warn you, Ethan, it will demand a sacrifice. The final confrontation was not a battle of strength, but of will. Eleanor, armed with knowledge passed down through generations of locals who knew the house's dark history, guided me. The entity, she explained, was an ancient, territorial spirit, a twisted matriarchal force that had latched onto the tragedies within the house, feeding on the pain and fear. The story of Sallie was its perfect camouflage, a mask of innocence to hide its monstrous nature. It didn't want to kill me, not yet. It wanted to break me, to turn me into another source of the misery it craved. The confrontation was to take place in the basement, the root of the sickness, as Mary's diary had called it. The air down there was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and something foul like rotted meat. Eleanor drew a circle of salt on the floor, placing candles at 4 points. It felt like a scene from a bad horror movie, and the last vestiges of my old skeptical self screamed in protest. But that part of me was a ghost now, a faint echo of the man I used to be. The man standing in that basement was a believer, baptized in fear and blood. As Eleanor began to chant in a low, steady voice, the house erupted in a final, violent tantrum. The lights flickered and died. A guttural roar echoed from the stone walls around us. The temperature plummeted, and our breath plumed in the frigid air. Tools and jars flew from shelves, smashing against the far wall. A cacophony of screams filled the air, a child's cry, a woman's shriek of rage, a man's tortured groan. It was the house disgorging all the pain it had absorbed over the centuries. Then, a cold, crushing pressure descended upon me. My chest tightened and I couldn't breathe. It felt as if a massive, invisible weight was trying to pulverize me. Through the swirling dust and darkness, I saw it materialize. The tall, shadowy woman, her form clearer now, her face a vortex of pure hatred, her eyes burning like hot coals. It lunged at me, not with hands, but with an overwhelming force of malevolence. "It wants your fear, Ethan." Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos. "Don't give it to it. You have to anchor it, give it something else to take." In that moment, staring into the face of impossible evil, I understood. Survival wasn't about fighting back. It was about sacrifice. It needed to take something, to leave its mark. I closed my eyes, and instead of fear, I focused on a memory. The day my divorce was finalized. The crushing weight of failure, the hollow ache of loss, the bitter taste of regret. It was the deepest wound in my soul. I offered it up, a conscious sacrifice. I laid my pain bare for the entity to feast upon. A final, agonizing scream ripped through the basement, and I felt a searing, blinding pain in my left hand. Then, silence. The oppressive weight lifted. The air grew warmer. One by one, the emergency lights I'd set up flickered back on. The entity was gone. It had not been defeated, but sated, appeased. When I looked down at my left hand, I saw the price of my survival. Etched into the back of my hand, as if branded there, were 3 deep black scars. They were not bleeding. They looked old, ancient, a permanent part of my flesh. I left Atchison the next day. I didn't finish the project. I didn't file a report. I just drove, leaving the Sallie House to its quiet, patient evil. My life is different now. I live with a new, fragile equilibrium, forever aware of the thin veil that separates our world from the one that lurks just beyond our perception. The physical scratches on my body have faded, but the 3 black marks on my hand remain, a constant, chilling reminder of the price I paid. I am no longer the man who walked into that house. The skeptic is dead, and in his place is a witness. A man who knows that evil is real, that some doors should never be opened, and that survival is never complete. I am marked, a living testament to the darkness that resides at 508 North 2nd Street. The house took a piece of my soul, and in exchange, it gave me a terrible, indelible knowledge. The ghosts of our past are nothing compared to the demons that are very, very real. Have you ever felt a presence you couldn't explain? Have you ever been touched by the unseen? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this chilling account, Please like and subscribe for more tales of supernatural horror.